Um, Welcome, everybody. I think we're going to start. It's a little bit past 9. So good morning and welcome. Hope everybody has a cup of coffee or tea in their hand and sitting in a nice place. My name is Matilda Andrén. I work at the Swedish Development Forum, more known as FUF, or Föreningen för utvecklingsfrågor. We are a membership-based organization that works with spreading knowledge about global sustainable development for a more just and fair world. But we're not here today alone. We're here together with the Nordiska Afrikainstitutet who conduct research and analysis about African countries, and we're very happy to have this conversation with them. Before we start to introduce the speakers today, I want to go through some instructions. Especially because everybody hasn't used Zoom before. This will be recorded. It will be up on FUF's webpage and NIA's webpage that you can follow later on and spread to your friends. But also it's important, if you don't want to be filmed, to turn off your webcam. It's also important that you are on mute the whole session. As you can see, we're over 140 people right now. So and we're expecting a few more people. So it's very important you have on mute the whole time. And you don't need to have your webcam on as well. It's also best to have speakers view on. If you're right now seeing around 150 small squares, you should press the upper right bottom, that I think it's around here. And you can choose speaker's view instead of gallery view, so you would just see the person that are speaking. So for today, we will first have a discussion between Lennart Wolgemut and Victor Adetula, and after the conversation we will have questions from the audience. But as you can see, and I told you before, we are very many people today, so if you want to ask a question, please write it down in the chat, and we will try to raise as many of the questions as possible. And also, please make sure that you have your name written down and the company or organization's name. You change that by by pressing your own picture, and you should take to the 3 dots and then you rename yourself. Yes. The 2 participants today, it's Lennart Wolgemut and Victor Adetula. Lennart Wolgemut is a board member of FUF and a guest professor in African knowledge with focus on Swedish and European aid by School of Global Studies at Gothenburg University. Before that, he worked 28 years at SIDA and been the director at the Nordiska Afrikainstitutet. Victor Adetula is a senior researcher at Nordiska Afrikainstitutet. He's an expert on democracy and governance, peace and conflict, African international relations, political economy of Africa, Europe-African relations, and international development assistance, and has a PhD in political science. So, as we know, we live in a very strange world right now, very characterized by Covid-19, and the Swedish media is mostly focusing on Sweden and the Swedish citizens. So today we're happy to have this conversation and go beyond that. So welcome, Lennart and Victor. I will take and will hand over to you, Lennart.
Thank you very much. Should I press somewhere?
No, we can see you. Perfect.
Used with very small meetings. We expected to have 30 people close by, sitting in the same room and discussing the situation in Africa today. We found, but as you cannot come to us, we have to come to you, and we find ourselves with almost 200 people listening to this discussion. This will make it very difficult, of course, to make it a dialogue between all people. So we will hope that you, via the chat, can present a lot of questions. Now, to the issue. I mean, we are so merged in the situation, in the corona situation here in the Nordic countries. So we have very difficult to lift our eyes above the horizon to see what happens in other parts of the world. But the scholars on Africa are, of course, very interested to see how Africa is facing this pandemic and this very difficult situation. And we are going to try in our dialogue to untangle a number of issues. Of course, we cannot answer to all questions. We are no public health specialists, so we are not being able to go into any sort of health issues, but we will try to cover as many fields as possible. Now, we will start with a question. Victor, can you tell us how serious is the pandemic now in Africa? How many are actually affected? And is it an issue for all countries in Africa today?
Thank you, Leonard. I think it's a good thing that we all acknowledge that the entire world is facing a pandemic of international magnitude. And interestingly enough, is that this is happening at a time when the world is considered a global village in terms of the very evident, network of interdependent relationship. And Africa happens to be a significant part of this world, and is affected in a way, and possibly not in the same scale as been experienced in other regions of the world, but not yet uhuru, because the expectation and concern is that as things unfold, Africa also will experience a very heavy pressure from this. But to answer very specifically to the question about the scope of those involved, I think it's now in between 55,000 confirmed cases. And I think more than 50% of that can be considered serious. And in terms of recovery, the rate of recovery is also in the range of 17,000, I think. And if you compare with what's obtained in other parts of the world, maybe some people may say, oh, why the panic? Well, evidently there is a panic. And that panic reaction and response is not necessarily limited to Africa, especially in the early weeks. Everybody, the world, feel the man is a human thing that when something happens and a lot of uncertainty, little knowledge about it, people engage initially in panic measure. But as the storm settled down, people go back to some logical reasoning through some of the issues, and you see a more strategic response to the issue. And I think that is where we are today.
So, so far there are a limited number of people actually who have died from the pandemic in Africa. At an early stage, when the pandemic started to spread over the world, there was a lot of fear raised in the media that Africa could be more seriously hit than other parts of the world because of the situation of the health services and so on. Is there any specific reasons why a pandemic should strike in Africa than in other places in the world?
Yes, what we have today is about 2,000 deaths. And again, when we're reporting this kind of thing, one needs to be careful and to qualify that. It's not likely that every death will be reported because there are issues about data where it happened. But to go back to in the media that Africa was hit. Let's set aside that media report. Let's go back to what the World Health Organization said. And that, because World Health Organization is the leading international institution managing this on behalf of the entire world. What health organization warn or advise that countries where the health infrastructures are not as well developed are most likely to experience greater impact of the pandemic. And of course, that is logical, because a lot of countries in Africa are having issues with their health system. That's to be expected. But let us add a caveat. Even countries where healthcare systems are working well before the COVID are experiencing this in a very, very unexpected way. So it is a kind of warning that, look, Africa needs to take this seriously. And part of that warning also came as while the coronavirus may take attention or may generate some panic measure, African countries should not fail to address other health issues, so that the effect of corona on the health system will be such that can be managed. But true to it, it's not very easy, or it has not been very easy for countries with weak health infrastructure to manage this. And that is evident. A lot of African government, African officials have already openly declared that, look, there are a lot of lessons being learned from this experience. Most of them realize how weak their health systems are in terms of capacity to accommodate the crisis.
Before we leave the discussion on figures, Africa is a continent, and we are talking about the figures and the whole continent. Can you distinguish differences between different parts of Africa where the virus has hit more, and in areas and in countries where so far they have hardly been hit at all?
Well, the only country is Lesotho that has not experienced a confirmed case of coronavirus. The only country. To date, as at this morning, so to speak, 53 countries have experienced. And of course, in different statistics. And South Africa was very, very high there. Yeah. Nigeria is coming up, Ghana is coming up, but these figures have to be in relation to the population of the country. That is one observation that needs to be made at the level of analysis. Another point that we need to take note of is that these statistics are wonderful, no doubt about it, but we have to look at the capacity of the various countries to carry out tests, and the willingness and availability of the people to present themselves for testing, and the availability of what needs to be used for testing. So we cannot go to the extreme in terms of using statistics of, oh, those who have tested, those who have not tested, for far-reaching decision. I think we need to qualify that.
Yeah. You have already mentioned a number of times the question of the health the sector and its weakness in many parts of Africa, and the lack of resources for testing, for care and so on. Is Africa preparing itself now for improving its health sector in order to take care of a bigger amount of sick people in the future?
Every country in the world is preparing within the knowledge that is available. That is one point. But even that, we have to identify that we're dealing with a lot of countries that have issues with resources to make that happen. So where we are today, like I said in the prefatory remarks, that look, initially there were a lot of panic measures, but now experts are settling down, and WHO is providing technical assistance to help think through how do we, within a short time period, get into a situation whereby these products that is needed to carry out the test, to equip the front runner in this battle, in terms of where to where, how to prepare themselves. So that is about, we are still 50-50, and this is across the world.
The next question is then the measures taken to avoid spread of the virus within the countries and between the countries. Some are quite astonished of how harsh measures many countries in Africa actually have taken in a very short period. Can you give tell us how these measures look like? Are they the same all over the place? Do they differentiate? Some are draconian, some are less draconian. Can you comment on this?
Well, you say some of you describe them as being harsh and draconian. Well, I would say they are measures, and maybe the way for me to start is to identify or to say that there have been responses at 3 levels, so to speak. One is, at the regional level, continental level, Africa, then maybe sub-regional, then the national. You seem to be interested in the national. But even globally, when the directive and advice from WHO came, and there's an aspect of it that interests me, that WHO advised all the countries to work within its own context in identifying, managing, and caring about the outbreak. And interestingly, they emphasize the point that there is no one-size-fits-all approach, and that all countries should frame strategy and measure to contain this transmission, and as well address the impact of the pandemic on the public life, on the economic life, and the social life. And I find that very, very interesting. And I can say that, look, to date, all countries and the African countries are conducting themselves in terms of identifying measure within this framework as it meets their own context, and the context differ. For instance, you look at Uganda, you look at Nigeria, restrictions, no movement. Some other countries didn't start, but as at the close of April, more than 75% of African countries have placed different types of restriction. But by last week, a lot of African countries have either adjusted or moderated the restrictions to allow for economic activity. And yet, even within that, there have been a lot of warning that, look, if the behavior of citizens in terms of compliance with social distancing and other hygienic directives, some of these countries might experience a second wave.
I think this is important to look a little further into. I mean, there are the measures taken are to avoid the spread of the disease.
Yes, the transmission.
In the special circumstances of Africa, with a very big part of the economy being in the informal, and people living from day-to-day work in order to survive, even rather lenient measures become draconian. Can you give a little more? I mean, how does people survive when they cannot move and when they need to move in order to get the daily survival strategy for their living.
Yeah, a very difficult balancing between curtailing transmission, the spread of the disease, and also ensuring livelihood. That is the difficult one for so many African governments. But within the strategy of curtailing transmission, the spread of the disease, a lot of palliative measures in terms of social protection for the most vulnerable groups have been put in place. How well they are working is another question, because that also has to be appreciated within the context of the resources available and the efficiency with which government is able to make this palliative available to the people that need it. But if you take a cursory look at how it has played out in the past few weeks, compliance has not been quite encouraging in terms of social distancing, even in terms of staying at home and not going out. People are coming out, they are protesting, they want to do this. And this is a combination of so many factors. If you like, you may say little knowledge about it. If you like, you may say, look, the determination or the survivor instinct that, look, what do I eat if I do not go out to look for these things? At another level, especially among the lower class, they see the corona disease as a disease of the rich. If you gauge the public perception, it's the disease of the rich because of, where did it come from? It came from abroad. Who are the people going abroad? It's the rich people. So this is not about us. So if you gauge this public perception, especially among the lower class, you possibly will understand why there have been a resistance to this stay at home and other form of restriction. But be that as it may, the various governments that put in place, there's hardly any African country where there have been restriction on movement and no palliative measures in place. But like I said, how well this is working to meet the maximum need of the people is another question.
But you see, countries are implementing these measures differently. You have reports from Kenya where you had strong repression, people being shot at if they are moving around. You see in South Africa where the government is now changing its policy because of the pressure of the people. So there is, if not a debate, at least a very strong political movements within the countries to react on the different measures that are being taken.
Well, I still feel, Leonard, that we need to put this in perspective, that there is no government in Africa that has asked any soldier or any police to shoot at people for no compliance. There is none. But again, we cannot rule out the possibility of overzealous government officials or overzealous security agents that may take laws into their hands. That is a possibility. I know, for instance, in Nigeria, there are mobile courts. And if you look at some of the sanction range between, fine, or compulsory community work. But not something as draconian as, shoot at sites. Now, and all the African countries that have put restrictions, usually the restrictions have been for a period. Say, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, after which we will review. That's what has happened. But like I said, and you got it very correct, that the people themselves are reacting. but not necessarily in an organized form, but because of survival instincts. So what do you want me to eat? If you ask me to stay back at home, you have not given me alternative, or you have embezzled. You know, there are individual pockets of reaction, but not in terms of, you know, an organized opposition.
But couldn't you say that the reactions in South Africa is not because of an organized, but because of an unorganized opposition?
Well, the case of South Africa presents a unique one, and I'm a little bit hesitant to say this. With or without Corona, the pattern of the pattern of politics in South Africa in the past few years have been that trend. And not only South Africa, even in Nigeria, it's very easy for people to march on the streets at the slightest provocation, because of the capacity of the state itself to manage conflict is minimal.
Yeah, there is a lack of trust for government interventions.
No, I will not dispute that. I mean, if you check Afrobarometer data for the past 10 years, of course, the level of trust in government is low across all the new democracies, no doubt about that. But in the past 2-3 years, that's almost becoming a universal trend, except if you check the statistics in the Scandinavia and the Nordic region. The level of trust in government has declined significantly.
A very difficult question to put, and is one that really affects all countries who are taking measures in order to try to tackle the pandemic, is the balance between saving lives directly and putting on measures which in the long term will make it very difficult for the economy to function and to revive. How much has this been discussed within at least within the governments and parliaments in Africa before these measures were introduced?
Of course, it's a discussion that is still going on. And let me go back to where we started, that this pandemic came, and it came in such a way that very little is known about how far. But WHO has been kind enough to tell us that, look, prepare yourself because it may be with us for a very long time. And I will say that decision-making, policy-making, governance procedures, governance processes in some of these new democracies are still evolving, as to be able to, well in advance, prepare and respond adequately to emergencies. No doubt about that. There's no debate about that. Now, and this has to do with weak institution, weak structure. That's that's known to everybody. But we have to give it that within this short time, there have been very significant, remarkable moves on the part of some of these governments. And let's start with the economy, for instance, economy. Some of these, at least very many of the countries that are responding have evolved new structures, new committee. In fact, in some cases, in some parliaments, some are revisiting the existing law that address issues of pandemic and disease of this nature and emergency. I can say that for Ghana and Nigeria. There have been a lot of debate in the House for this to happen. And the executive of this government have set up specific committees to address issues of economy. What will be the response of the state? Assess the impact of coronavirus on various sectors. And a few examples caught my attention. In Botswana and Uganda, the government of this country encourage what they call repurposing line of industry that allow industry that were engaged in a particular line of production before the corona now to move that same resources into other sectors to meet the immediate need. And that happened in Botswana from the manufacturing of perfume to sanitizer. And in Uganda, from production of wine and gin to sanitizer. And I think that's very encouraging, given the short time. And it's not limited even to the national government. If you look at, for instance, at the level of African Union is doing a lot of encouragement. It set up a number of committees, appointed special envoy to address issue of economy, and even set up a special fund to help Africa address this. And lastly, African Development Bank came up with a promise of, I think, $10 billion loan facilities for African countries in 3 different segments. Countries involved in oil export like Nigeria and Angola, so that it will cushion the effects of the drop in price of oil. Then target the organized private sector. And also the third segment to African countries that are in the low income bracket, so that they can address the need of the most vulnerable group. I think there have been a lot of responses at that level.
It's not only new democracies who have difficulties in this balancing between economy and health. It's a problem everywhere, as we are quite aware of in our daily reading the daily news all around the world. Now this turns, and you have already started, that is a third dimension. We have talked about the pandemic as such. We have talked about the measures to tackle this. But there is a third element for Africa, and that is what happens around the world and the effects of how other countries are actually tackling their pandemic by closing borders, stopping exports, imports, no tourism coming to Africa, the oil price falling because of the international response to the pandemic. Can you describe how Africa is this a question for the formal sector more than for the informal sector? Is this a question more for the rich than the poor, or how does this affect Africa?
Okay. It's affecting Africa, and it's expected that it will affect Africa. And I think it was last night I was reflecting a lot of anxiety and concern for Africa around this time. And I said, well, there are reasons for that to happen. Historically, Africa has been significant to the world economy. That's it, one, to date. And Africa is the place to be in the 21st century. In terms of the natural resources, everybody wants to be in Africa. In terms of the big market, everybody wants to be in Africa. Now, and if you look at the structure of the African economy, how it is integrated into the world economy, you do expect that even beyond the growing interdependence of states, Africa is tied to the world economy in a very peculiar way, and including its real economy. There are a lot of small scale, medium scale business in Africa that are dependent on what happens in China, for instance. Just to look at that in the most recent time, not to talk about the period before now. So both the real economy and the big sector, they are most involved. And we have seen that already with the oil exploration, investment in Africa, what has happened to commodity price, what is happening to foreign exchange, what is happening to capital markets within a short time. We are talking about less than 3 months, and we can already feeling the impact across all the sector of the economy. Is it possible for any sector of the economy to survive? Of course, yes, and I have pointed out a few initiatives that is coming up. But there's a great lesson that is being learned in all this. And the great lesson is how to develop the local capacity. I think that is one great lesson that is being learned. But in terms of impact, both the rich and the poor, they are experiencing the effects of COVID-19.
Yeah, but the international impact is, of course, bigger on the modern, in the formal sector than on the informal sector.
I will say we don't have enough data to prove that yet. But if you look at the fact that, okay, let's look at tourism, for instance. Yeah. Look at tourism. Tourism is big. 10% of global GDP worldwide comes from tourism. But in Africa, it's an emerging sector. If the projection is right, between 20 and 30% growth rates in the tourism sector will experience a decrease. What happens to labor in that sector? I think the record shows about 50 million people might lose their job. So it depends on how you categorize the tourism industry in Africa. If you say it's big, that's 50 million people out of job. Let's look at South Africa. South Africa is already complaining that is going back, is going back. And for so many African countries that are already in economic depression, or almost, some have not even declared. So I'm not too sure that we can make strong dichotomy between informal sector and the big side of the economy. The point is that people are getting out of job. Airlines are going to let people go. All sector going to let people go. Some of the chief executives will go back home. So I think it's across that. And for many people in Africa, I don't think the issue is about where in the economy you belong now. It's about, look, we are not able to put food on table. We may not be able to put food on table, both in the medium and long term, and that's very challenging.
A very big part of the African population is below 30 years. It's a young population, and according to the present wisdom, the pandemic hits older more than younger people. Could that be looking now forward? What will come out of this pandemic? Could that lead to that Africa will come out less hurt in the end than other parts of the world?
Well, I share your optimism. I share your optimism that Africa will come and the whole world will come out of this fine. But I'm not in a hurry to make conclusions about this, because it's not only the age of population that determines what happens in future. And even at that, I was listening to a brief analysis not long ago in one country in West Africa, and they discovered that the casualty has been below 22 and 40 years. That's death has concentrated between 22. So there's no very hard data that we can rely on these. And the way it obtains in different regions of the world is a different thing. Again, I want to qualify this in economy or society where people have very severe underlying diseases that has really reduced their immunity. I think, I mean, there are a lot of other things that we need to put into consideration. I'm not a medical expert, but what I know so far is that there is no treatment for COVID-19. There is no vaccine for COVID-19. So when somebody is confirmed as having the virus, what is done is to isolate that person so that it does not spread in the community, and to help that person boost immunity so that the person's immunity can overcome that virus. That does not constitute a treatment. So regardless of the age of the person, if the immunity is already low, the person is vulnerable.
Yeah, you said I'm not very optimistic. You said you are optimistic about the future.
No, you started that. You said that the future of Africa.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to find signs which might make it easier for Africa to come out of this than perhaps other areas of the world. But you have already questioned that in this point. So, but what other looking more now? I mean, we have talked about sort of the pandemic. We have talked about the measures taken. We have talked about the impact from the rest of the world now, and all this. At least in the short run, makes it quite a bleak situation. Now, how is Africa going to get out of this? I mean, we can see signs already. By some countries are now cutting down on some of the measures. Do you see a slow process now, or do you see that there will be with this pressure particularly from people in the informal sector in order to survive, will there be conflicts?
My optimism also based on science. I'm also a scientist like you, and the whole world is looking for scientific way of getting around this, including discovery around herbs and other measures. That's a joke. But on a more serious note, I'm also optimistic. If you go back, Leonard, if you go back, and this optimism for me is not coming from focusing on individual African strategy, as it is the willingness of countries to locate and put their strategy within the global discussion for a solution. And that fits in well into the spirit and letter of the SDG. I think it is SDG number, what is it now? Number 3, that talk about well-being and health. And closely related to that is SDG 17 that emphasize partnership. I think the future of Africa and the future of humanity in terms of first overcoming this pandemic lie in actualizing the vision of SDG in terms of coming together and pulling resources together, idea, material, human resource together, and they will be out of this. But there are a lot of lessons for African countries in terms of building a very strong healthcare infrastructure and healthcare system and strategy in such a way that it can address emergency. I think that's for me.
Okay, Victor, I think we have tried to cover the whole picture. Now, I've seen a lot of questions coming in. So Matilda, can you
Yes.
pick out some of the most strongest question, most difficult question for me
it's
and
very hard
Victor?
to decide what questions, but we're going to try to raise most of them. But we have a question from Maria Jakobsson that I think is very interesting. How big is the risk of deliberate underreporting by governments out of fear of what a lockdown can do about economic development? A good example is Tanzania. I think it's a
Did you
question
hear,
for both
Victor?
of you.
Oh, I didn't hear that.
Okay.
Let me hear that from you.
Yes. How big is the risk of deliberate underreporting by governments out of fear of what a lockdown can do about economic development? Example is Tanzania. That the governments are going to underreport cases of COVID out of fear what a lockdown can do to the economy.
Leonard, you want to go first?
No, you go first.
Okay, yeah. Well, for me, I think when we're discussing, I said that there are challenges of governance itself. In societies where there are challenges of governance, accountability, of course, COVID-19 will only come to worsen the case. Where governments are reluctant to provide data and information, I think it will be worse that. And it's part of the lesson learned from this experience. Because even where people want to intervene and they don't have the correct data base on which to do that, I think there's need to preach again and advocate for transparency in governance. I think for me, that is it. There's need for transparency in governance, because when the information is not available, it makes planning very difficult, and it's planning in the dark. Let's take, for instance, the issue of palliative measures. There are so many places where, they've not been reached because people don't even register. So for me, again, it's not only the responsibility of government alone. Both the government and the people should take transparency very seriously so that countries can have national database which we to do planning. And I think that's important for economic development.
So in other words, it's not only the deliberate work on not reporting, it's also much more the lack of knowledge and channels to report about. And actually, no one knows very much about this this virus, and most questions are very difficult to answer. Okay, next question.
Yes, you have talked a little bit about this before, and this is from Johan Eldebo at World Vision. We're preparing for a long-term extensive food crisis across Africa and expecting both food aid and cash transfer to be needed to scale up significantly. Are there any insights on what lessons we would have learned from past crises on how to respond at the scale that will be needed in terms of coordinating over the long term? So if we have learned something from crisis before, especially now when we need food aid and cash transferred to scale up.
Okay, let me start on this one. It's not only what we have learned from the past. It's in most countries in the world, governments and the people are looking inward, and they are concentrating on their own problems and their own measures. And the reason why we have this discussion is that there is so little discussion about what's actually happening in Africa and other parts of the world. So I mean, there will be, and it has already shown, it's much more difficult to get funds for any type of support activities all around the world, and also for supporting people with food aid in who are now suffering from from the problems of the pandemic. So I mean, it's not only that the lessons of the past, it's also the lessons of the present. It will be very tough to get support started. I mean, most civil society organizations who are engaging themselves in supporting poor people all around the world have big difficulties to get the funds, but they also have big difficulties in meeting new demands, which requires flexibility they have never experienced from before. They have to be flexible. They have to change from what they did yesterday to something completely different. And many of them are prepared to do that, but are the funders prepared to accept this flexibility? Victor, do you want to add?
Yeah, well, one thing, I don't think this is the time to expect that there will be much aid to anybody or to any part. I think any strategy that is based exclusively on aid, I don't see sustainability in that. The second point, and I think lesson that has come out of this, again, I go back to the issue of preparation and capacity to meet emergency. I don't know what anybody who is going to be interested in that study to look at the capacity of African governments in terms of managing emergency. Let's even look at their budgets. Some of them put it at the mercy of donors. And where are the donors? So if already in planning for your future, you do not provide for that from your local resources, I don't think it's going to be successful. And if we take a critical look at what is happening today, a lot of ad hoc arrangement is coming into play. And that is why it's not working. But if the system has been made, framed in such a way that the level of alertness and preparation is at least the first strike capability will have been stronger than what we have now.
Tilda?
Yes. Okay, even if you say that aid isn't the big strategy, we have a question from Kalle Bergqvist, who says, can any of you see a common strategy of Swedish civil society to respond to the crisis?
I will leave that to Leonard.
Yeah, I have been interviewing a number of civil society organizations in the past few weeks. So I have seen that there is a big openness for flexibility to meet new demands. And I interviewed the State Secretary for Development Cooperation 2 weeks ago on the same channel with a FUF society hat on my head, and asked the question about the Swedish government if they are prepared for flexibility. And he said that that the government has taken away the demand for self-financing by the civil society organizations in this period to meet additional demands and open up for more flexibility. So this is a discussion that is taking place, and it's of course a discussion between the civil society organizations and SIDA, who is in Sweden responsible for that. And I guess that a similar discussion is taking place in all other Nordic countries.
Thank you. We have a question about Tanzania, because Tanzania, just like Sweden in Europe, has been suggested to be the odd man out in this approach to manage the pandemic. Could you please make a comment on the Tanzania approach?
When you say that Tanzania is odd, what exactly is that, Lena?
Yeah, there has been discussion that Tanzania has shown, and they say it themselves, they have chosen more lenient sort of measures than others. But in a discussion the other day on Zoom, which headed by UNDP, a person from Tanzania of UNDP explained what they were doing in Tanzania, and it looked very similar to what they are doing in most other countries. They might be less stringent on some of the measures, but they have taken very similar measures that most, as far as I can see and what I have heard so far.
I like the bit that attempt a comparison with Sweden. Is that not, Matilda?
Yes, it's the comparison,
Okay.
and that they're taking a different approach. It doesn't need to be odd.
Yeah, I think that is the angle that I like to comment on. And again, I go back to what the WHO said. Look at what suits your situation, your context. But be sincere that you are addressing the risk very rapidly in such a way that you are curtailing transmission and you are putting your eye on possible impact on the social and economic life of the people. And I've lived in this society for some time and I've moved around. And I think maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm right. If it is not broken, why do you want to fix it? If the level of social consciousness and awareness of people will move them to do the right thing, then why do you need to police them? I think that is it. So if in another society, the level of civic awareness, the level of civic responsibility is not so that can result into a high level of compliance, then maybe some enforcement comes into, I'm just using terms in this case. So that's why Sweden has done what it has done, and it's working well for Sweden because of some background context. So if another country finds itself in such way, okay, it can also copy what it is. I think that's going to be my response to that.
Thank you. We have a question about AUC from Nikolaus on CSB. Is the AUC giving any recommendations to the countries or support?
AUC is what, African Union?
Yes.
Okay.
You take it.
Okay. I think what African Union has done is one, to come up with a continental strategy. And that continental strategy, to implement it is going to cost about $420 million US. And part of it is to support African countries to be able to do these tests and to be able to revive some of the health infrastructure. And to make this happen, it has set up a COVID-19 fund and appointed envoys that will go around to get support from donors, from international community, and even from African states to make this happen. And this also being scaled down to the level of regional institutions like ECOWAS and SADC with responsibility to help African countries in various ways. But the main problem now is raising that resources. I'm not too sure they have even been able to raise 20% of that yet. And part of the responsibility of the envoy and the fund advisory board is to also try and see how they can negotiate debt relief. So that is what AU is doing now.
perhaps one should add that there is a big difference between AU and EU, in the sense that EU has much more possibility to they are responsible for a number of areas where they can act, while AU mainly can recommend to the governments within. They are trying within their sort of mandate.
I think that should be expected, because EU for long has been operating as a supranational, with strong supranational arrangement, and it has a budget for emergency. It has budget to intervene. I'm not sure that to date, African Union has a budget for that until this happens, because the structures and arrangements are things that happen within the past 2 months. Another lesson learned for African institutions.
Matilda?
Yes. Since civil society registration is largely absent in many African countries, how well can we trust the reports on incidents and mortality?
Coming in, Matilda.
It's a hard one, maybe. Since
no, let me hear that.
Yeah.
How much you can trust the statistics? I mean, I think that Victor has already said that before. I mean, there are a number of reasons. One is that statistics in general is a difficult issue. Secondly, that there might be some interest in showing certain statistics and not other statistics. And thirdly, how do you, in a country where you haven't had a specific illness before, and you have still other, and I think this is an area, perhaps Victor, you can talk a little more about other illnesses like malaria and so on, who is much more prevalent.
Well, yes.
And how can you can you really distinguish what is corona and what is not corona? I mean, statistics is a difficult field.
But again, statistics are relevant, no doubt about it, for decision making. But I don't think it's as was as the colleague that raised the question that how can we trust the figures. One of the things that is beginning to happen now, and again part of the lesson learned, is the relevance of the community structure, especially in pushing through with this social protection palliatives coming under the social protection programs. Because people are beginning to realize, even governments are beginning to realize, that some of the statistics are not as correct as relying on the community structure. Because if you take Tanzania, for instance, I know in Tanzania they had this age-long 10-cell system, know your neighbor. Yeah. That every 10-cell leader knows who stays in any place. But I think where the challenge is coming from is ignoring the essence of these community structures and latching on quantification to drive the process. And a lot of things comes in. So while I'm not saying that these statistics are not important, it's just a matter, let us see how we can match the community structure, the input from the community structure with this quantification, and I think we'll get a better result.
Yes, we will have the last question. We have a lot of questions today, but we will have the last one now. In which tangible ways will COVID-19 have changed Africa if we look 10 years ahead of now? I know it's hard to look 10 years ahead, but try to say a few words just about how it will look in 10 years.
Okay, that question then will help us to wind up.
Yes,
so
I think that's
Victor,
a good one.
You start sort of winding up, and I'll
okay.
follow.
Well, both myself and Lena will express optimism, but there are a number of variables that need to be considered. Yeah, one, Africa, we have to appreciate, is within a global system. So I think there's need for us to sustain the emerging global consciousness on partnership, collaboration, cooperation. And if we focus on the SDG, the spirits of the SDG, I think there's a lot to take in there. But one get discouraged if you see what is happening, especially between and among the big powers, rather than work within that framework of SDG of how do we facilitate, promote global partnership and collaboration. This blaming game cannot do it. And for Africa specifically, I think there are a lot of lessons that has come out of this. Ebola happened not too long ago, and this one now. Definitely there's going to be a lot of focus on the health sector. How do we rebuild the health system? And you cannot rebuild the health system without addressing the issue of poverty and economic development, because they interlink. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, we have taken on a very big task today to try to explain how the pandemic is hitting Africa, and even discussing what the effects for the future. We have only touched some of the major issues. We haven't even discussed certain issues which are really high on the level. What will it mean in the future with the relationship? What happens with the relation with China? What happens with the relation with the United States? The EU we just don't know what is going to come out of this pandemic. But I think the idea with this meeting has been to try to raise a number of issues which are very important in trying to assess what is actually happening in Africa today, and how Africa is intertwined with the rest of the world. I mean, you cannot talk about one country anymore. I mean, an illness that starts in December in China has become a pandemic in the whole world 3 months afterwards. And we are all on the same boat. And to solve the problem in Sweden, or to solve the problem in China, or to solve the problem in Brazil is not enough. One has also taken in the rest of the world, because otherwise we are affected the second or third time, and it's going around. So I think what is most important is to see how close we are, all of us, and that what happens in Africa is also what happens for us, with us. Thank you very much for so many people listening for so long. We are coming back and to discuss further on what is happening. And I hope that we can be more optimistic. Thank you very much.